Xerxes the First, often remembered in history as Xerxes the Great, was born into one of the most powerful dynasties of the ancient world, the Achaemenid Empire. The son of Darius I, the formidable Persian king who had extended the empire to its greatest territorial expanse, and Queen Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, Xerxes' lineage was nothing short of legendary. From the very moment of his birth, he was destined to inherit immense power and immense responsibility. Yet, as history reveals, the path to his throne was neither smooth nor free of peril, and the very power he inherited would eventually distort his character and shape the tragic fate of those closest to him, including his daughters. Xerxes' early life was steeped in privilege and education, as befitted a prince of Persia. He was trained in the arts of leadership, military strategy, and governance, but also in the intricate etiquette and courtly rituals that governed life in the Achaemenid palace. From a young age, he would have been acutely aware of the fragility of royal favor and the ever-present threat of conspiracies. The Persian court, while opulent, was also a place of constant intrigue. Princes, generals, and ministers often vied for influence over the king, and the line between favor and fatal suspicion was perilously thin. As the eldest son of Darius I, Xerxes was naturally groomed to succeed his father. However, his path was complicated by the politics of succession that were common in Persian royalty. Royal sons, despite their birthright, were not guaranteed their throne. The Achaemenid tradition often saw fratricide, exile, or political maneuvering as tools to secure the king's lineage. Even as a young prince, Xerxes would have been acutely aware that his claim to power depended not only on birth, but on his ability to command loyalty and outmaneuver rivals within the palace. The early signs of Xerxes' temperament and character began to emerge during these formative years. Ancient sources, including Herodotus, suggest that Xerxes was a man capable of both extraordinary ambition and profound cruelty. The lessons he learned at his father's side were not limited to governance and strategy. They included the harsh reality that kingship demanded ruthlessness. Darius himself had faced numerous revolts and rebellions, both within the empire and from external forces, and he ruled with a mixture of stern justice and uncompromising severity. Xerxes absorbed these lessons well, internalizing the idea that power could only be maintained through authority, fear, and, when necessary, absolute control. When Darius I died in 486 BCE, Xerxes ascended the throne. His coronation marked the culmination of years of preparation, but it also inaugurated a reign fraught with pressure. As king, Xerxes inherited an empire that stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west, encompassing diverse peoples, languages, and cultures. Governing such a vast territory was no small task. It required not only administrative skill but also a constant demonstration of authority to prevent uprisings and maintain loyalty among satraps, provincial governors who wielded considerable local power. Any perceived weakness could be exploited, and any hint of disloyalty had to be crushed swiftly. The young king's rise to power was accompanied by a series of challenges that would shape his reign and, ultimately, his legacy. Xerxes faced revolts on multiple fronts, including regions in Egypt and Babylonia, where local rulers often sought to exploit moments of imperial transition to assert independence. To secure his position, Xerxes had to project strength immediately. He displayed both strategic acumen and a capacity for ruthlessness, quelling dissent with measures that were severe but, in his eyes, necessary to stabilize the empire. These early actions demonstrated that Xerxes' rule would be defined by the combination of ambition, authoritarianism, and a sometimes brutal approach to governance. Yet, the rise of Xerxes was not purely shaped by political and military pressures. It was also influenced by personal ambition and the psychological weight of his lineage. Being the son of Darius I and a grandson of Cyrus the Great meant that Xerxes carried the weight of immense historical expectation. He was not just a king, he was the living embodiment of the Achaemenid legacy. Such a burden can inspire greatness, but it can also distort judgment and intensify paranoia. Historical accounts suggest that Xerxes became increasingly suspicious of those around him, interpreting loyalty as fragile and even family bonds as potential threats to his authority. These tendencies, nurtured in the crucible of his rise to power, would later manifest in tragic ways, particularly within his own household. Xerxes' early reign was also marked by a desire to leave a mark on the world that would surpass even that of his father. He embarked on grand architectural projects and ambitious campaigns, most notably the invasion of Greece, which has immortalized him in the annals of history. These ventures were fueled by a combination of imperial duty, personal ambition, and, at times, hubris. They required not only military strategy, but also the management of immense resources and the oversight of a sprawling bureaucracy. Xerxes' determination to assert his dominance over the known world reflected both the confidence instilled in him by his upbringing and the psychological pressures that accompanied his kingship. However, this period of grand ambition was accompanied by the seeds of personal and familial tragedy. The same qualities that enabled Xerxes to rise to power, the drive, the ruthlessness, and the acute awareness of potential threats, also predisposed him to a harsh and controlling attitude toward those closest to him. In the courtly culture of Persia, where lineage and succession were matters of life and death, even the king's own children could be viewed through the lens of political utility or potential threat. The combination of personal ambition, imperial pressure, and paranoia created a volatile environment within the palace, one in which even the most innocent could suffer. By the time Xerxes had firmly established himself as king, he was a man both respected and feared. His rise from prince to monarch had been marked by careful calculation, decisive action, and an uncompromising approach to power. Yet, the very qualities that had enabled his ascent also foreshadowed the darker aspects of his reign. History remembers Xerxes not only for his military campaigns and monumental constructions, but also for the fear and cruelty that he wielded as a tool of authority. It is within this context that the tragic stories of his daughters must be understood, a tale of innocence caught in the shadow of absolute power, where the rise of a king casts a long and often devastating shadow over his own family. In examining the rise of Xerxes, one sees the complex interplay of ambition, upbringing, political necessity, and personal temperament. The trajectory from prince to king was shaped by both external pressures and internal drives, and it forged a ruler capable of extraordinary feats and extraordinary cruelty. The world into which his daughters were born was a world where power was absolute, loyalty was fragile, and even the king's love could be overshadowed by the imperatives of authority. Understanding Xerxes' ascent is crucial to understanding the later tragedies that would unfold within the royal household, and it reveals how the burdens of kingship can distort the human heart, sometimes with consequences far worse than death. The Persian royal court of Xerxes. The first was a place of extraordinary wealth, luxury, and ceremonial grandeur, a world designed to awe, impress, and maintain the aura of absolute power. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the lives of those within, particularly the king's daughters, were bound by strict rules, hierarchical structures, and unspoken fears. To outsiders, the harem might have appeared a haven of beauty, leisure, and indulgence, but for the princesses it was also a gilded cage, a space where innocence was constantly shadowed by expectation, surveillance, and the ever-present reality of their father's power. From birth, the daughters of Xerxes were enveloped in an environment that combined opulence with rigid discipline. The royal palace, a sprawling labyrinth of halls, gardens, and chambers, functioned as both home and fortress. In these confines, the princesses' upbringing was carefully orchestrated. They were instructed in etiquette, languages, music, and poetry, preparing them to fulfill their roles as both symbols of Persian royal prestige and potential tools in political alliances. The education they received was meticulous, yet heavily gendered, emphasizing beauty, grace, and subservience as much as intellect and awareness. Their accomplishments were measured not solely by personal merit, but by how they enhanced the image of the king and the dynasty he ruled. Despite the privileges afforded to them, life in the royal harem was not free from constraint. Every movement, conversation, and action was monitored, often by attendants and eunuchs whose loyalty was first to the king and second to the household. Privacy was rare, and the concept of persona. Freedom was almost non-existent. Even within the walls of their private chambers, the princesses were acutely aware that they were never entirely alone. Every gesture could be scrutinized, every emotion potentially interpreted as defiance or ambition. For children raised in such an environment, innocence was inevitably tinged with fear and self-restraint, a lesson in survival as much as etiquette. The hierarchy within the harem itself was complex and rigid. The king's wives, concubines, and female relatives were ranked according to status, influence, and favor, and the princesses, though blood relatives of the king, were still subject to this intricate social structure. Favor could shift suddenly. A glance or word from Xerxes could elevate one woman and condemn another to relative obscurity. Within this system, the daughters were often caught between admiration and rivalry, affection and suspicion. Friendships were rare, and alliances even rarer, as every relationship was framed by the political realities of court life. In such an environment, the princesses learned early that appearances mattered more than truth, and obedience was valued above all else. Yet despite these pressures, there were moments of genuine childhood and tenderness. The daughters would have spent time with tutors, engaged in games within the palace gardens, and participated in ceremonial functions that celebrated their lineage. They were taught stories of Persian heroes, of their grandfather Cyrus the Great and their father Darius the First, legends meant to inspire loyalty, pride, and courage. These narratives, however, often carried a dual message. Greatness comes with power, but power comes with vigilance, suspicion, and, ultimately, the capacity for cruelty. Even in play and education, the seeds of their later torment were being sown as they were groomed to recognize the delicate balance between loyalty and survival. The royal harem was not merely a domestic space, it was a political institution. Marriages, betrothals, and alliances were carefully orchestrated to secure the king's influence both within and beyond the empire. The princesses, as members of the royal bloodline, were pivotal in these calculations. Their marriages could strengthen ties with powerful satraps or neighboring kingdoms, while their conduct could serve as a model of Persian decorum and virtue. This constant pressure to embody political utility rather than personal desire limited their autonomy and subjected them to the whims of a father whose perception of control extended into every aspect of their lives. Even small acts of independence, speaking freely, choosing companions, or expressing opinion, were potential provocations, reminders of the delicate line they had to walk. Security within the palace was another defining aspect of their lives. Persian kingship was inseparable from the culture of vigilance and suspicion. Assassination, betrayal, and rebellion were not abstract possibilities, but real and constant threats. Guards and eunuchs patrolled corridors, and secret passages connected chambers, allowing the king to observe or intervene at will. The daughters, therefore, grew up in an environment where freedom of movement was restricted, and the notion of escape, either physically or emotionally, was largely theoretical. Even their closest confidants were, in practice, agents of the royal surveillance system, reinforcing the sense that the palace, no matter how lavish, was also a prison of expectation and fear. The psychological impact of this environment on Xerxes' daughters cannot be overstated. The combination of privilege and constraint produced a paradoxical childhood, one of both grandeur and anxiety. They were cherished and protected, yet constantly reminded of the consequences of disobedience or misjudged actions. Love and fear were intertwined, Adoration for their father existed alongside an intuitive awareness that his favor could be as terrifying as his wrath. This duality, common in courts throughout history, created a fragile sense of security that would ultimately make them highly vulnerable when the king's darker tendencies emerged. Cultural expectations further compounded these pressures. Persian royal women were expected to embody ideals of beauty, chastity, and decorum, serving as symbols of the empire's power and sophistication. Their education in music, literature, and etiquette was not for personal enrichment alone, but to maintain the prestige of the royal household. Every appearance, every word, and every action was a reflection of the king's authority. Mistakes, even innocent ones, could be interpreted as insults to the crown. In this context, the princesses' lives were dominated by the constant balancing act of pleasing their father, maintaining appearances, and avoiding missteps that could have disastrous consequences. Amid these layers of training, hierarchy, and surveillance, the daughters of Xerxes were, in many ways, invisible as individuals. Their identities were defined by the roles they were expected to play as heirs to the dynasty, symbols of the king's power, and instruments in political alliances. Their personal desires, ambitions, and dreams were secondary to the demands of royalty. Even acts of personal expression, art, music, or study, were framed within the context of royal duty. The palace, though physically magnificent, offered little space for authentic selfhood. Innocence persisted, but it was fragile, constantly tested by the weight of expectation and the unpredictable temperament of their father. Ultimately, life in the royal harem was a study in contrasts, luxury and confinement, education and restriction, love and fear. The daughters of Xerxes existed within a world of unparalleled privilege, yet one in which their very survival depended on obedience, vigilance, and the careful management of perception. They were nurtured, educated, and protected, yet at every turn reminded that their value was tied to their usefulness to the king and the empire. This paradox, being both cherished and controlled, shaped their early lives and prepared them tragically for the horrors that would later unfold under the hand of a father whose absolute power knew no moral bounds. Understanding the delicate, perilous environment of the royal harem is essential to comprehending the experiences of Xerxes' daughters. Within these walls, they learned to navigate fear disguised as instruction, love shadowed by authority, and innocence constrained by tradition. It was a childhood of contradictions, one of beauty, ceremony, and knowledge, yet simultaneously one of surveillance, control, and limitation. And it was within this gilded, fragile world that the seeds of later tragedy were planted, a tragedy that would reveal the full extent of the darkness that absolute power could cast over even the most innocent of lives. Xerxes I, once a young prince groomed for kingship under the watchful eye of his father Darius I, had, by the time of his reign, transformed into a figure whose power was matched only by the intensity of his paranoia. The rise to the throne, though marked by careful preparation and strategic acumen, had exposed him to the harsh realities of ruling an empire of unparalleled scale. Xerxes inherited not only the authority of the Achaemenid dynasty, but also the burdens and insecurities of leadership, a complex web of threats, both internal and external, that would ultimately shape his temperament and his approach to governance. Over time, this blend of inherited pressure, political necessity, and personal disposition began to manifest in ways that would haunt his own family, particularly his daughters, who became innocent victims of his growing tyranny. From the beginning of his rule, Xerxes' reign was punctuated by the constant threat of rebellion. The Persian Empire stretched from the fertile banks of the Indus River to the arid plains of Egypt and the Mediterranean coasts. Governing such a diverse realm required not only administrative skill but also an unyielding display of authority. Xerxes quickly learned that any hint of weakness or hesitation could invite revolt. The lessons of his father's reign, where regional satraps occasionally challenged imperial authority, were never far from his mind. Yet the weight of these responsibilities, combined with the inherent instability of royal succession, the Achaemenid tradition, seeded a growing suspicion in the young king. If enemies lurked in the provinces, why not within the palace itself? Paranoia, in Xerxes' case, was not simply an abstract fear, it was a survival mechanism honed by experience. Even among his closest advisors, he scrutinized motives and measured loyalty with meticulous care. Courtiers who failed to meet his expectations or who exhibited independent influence risked being removed from favor, or worse. This intense vigilance extended beyond political allies to his own household. The king's daughters, though beloved, were not immune from the shadow of his mistrust. In Xerxes' mind, power was a fragile and precarious possession, and even family could unwittingly or deliberately pose a threat. His paranoia transformed the palace into a theater of observation, where every gesture and word was weighed for hidden meaning. Several factors contributed to the escalation of Xerxes' paranoia. Foremost among them was the cultural and political context of the Achaemenid court. Royalty in Persia. EA was surrounded by intricate hierarchies, ceremonial obligations, and the ever-present reality of political intrigue. Assassinations, betrayals, and coups were not theoretical possibilities. They were documented occurrences within the empire. As king, Xerxes bore ultimate responsibility for the security of the state, and this duty fostered a mindset in which suspicion became a prerequisite for survival. The line between necessary vigilance and obsessive control, however, was perilously thin, and over time Xerxes crossed it, allowing fear to dictate his actions as much as reason or strategy. External pressures also played a pivotal role in shaping his outlook. The threat of rebellion, particularly in regions like Babylonia and Egypt, demanded decisive military campaigns and the imposition of strict authority. Additionally, the looming conflict with Greece, a series of invasions and battles that would consume vast resources and require absolute obedience from commanders and subjects alike, reinforced the perception that the empire was under siege on all fronts. Xerxes came to equate loyalty with survival and dissent with existential danger. These lessons, learned in the crucible of empire, were internalized in ways that made him increasingly intolerant of even the faintest suggestion of defiance, whether in his generals, ministers, or family members. As his reign progressed, the paranoia that had been a tool for survival gradually mutated into cruelty. The distinction between genuine threats and imagined ones blurred, and the king's response to perceived disloyalty became disproportionately severe. Historical accounts describe Xerxes as a ruler capable of extraordinary punishment against those he deemed unfaithful or insufficiently subservient. Such actions were not merely political, they were deeply personal. In his mind, the maintenance of absolute authority justified extreme measures, even when applied to those he was supposed to love and protect. The seeds of tyranny, sown in the early years of his reign, now began to bear fruit in ways that would ultimately touch his own household. The environment within the palace exacerbated these tendencies. Xerxes' daughters, raised within the gilded yet confined world of the royal harem, were constantly under observation. Their upbringing, though filled with education, culture, and ceremony, was inseparable from the politics of power. The very skills they were taught, obedience, decorum, grace, and diplomacy, were intended to make them symbols of the king's authority and instruments in political alliances. Yet these lessons could just as easily be misinterpreted as signs of ambition, independence, or disobedience. The daughters' innocence and adherence to their expected roles were no guarantee of safety. Indeed, in a court where suspicion reigned supreme, even a misinterpreted word or action could provoke wrath. Xerxes' paranoia was further intensified by the legacy of fear and control embedded in Persian royalty. Previous kings, including his father Darius, had ruled with a combination of reverence and intimidation. The young king internalized the belief that fear was not only an effective tool but a necessary one. This mindset translated into the domestic sphere, where the king's household, traditionally a sanctuary of familial bonds, became an extension of the mechanisms he employed to control the empire. His daughters, despite their royal blood, were subject to the same principles: constant surveillance, rigorous expectations, and the implicit understanding that disobedience could have catastrophic consequences. Even advisors and attendants played into this culture of paranoia. Eunuchs, servants, and officials were both protectors and informants, responsible for maintaining order within the palace and ensuring that the king remained aware of any potential threats. In such a system, trust was a rare commodity. Xerxes' daughters, who had once experienced genuine affection and care within the palace, grew increasingly aware that their father's attention could not always be equated with safety or protection. Love and fear became inseparably entwined, creating an atmosphere of psychological tension that would haunt them throughout their lives. The consequences of this growing tyranny were both immediate and long-lasting. Within the palace, relationships were strained, loyalty was constantly tested, and the princesses' emotional well-being was jeopardized by the unpredictable nature of their father's moods. The skills they had been taught, grace, obedience, diplomacy, were insufficient to shield them from the psychological impact of living under a ruler whose vigilance had turned into oppressive control. The innocence they once possessed was eroded by constant exposure to fear and suspicion, and their understanding of the world became inseparable from the lessons of caution, vigilance, and emotional restraint. Paranoia, unchecked by empathy or compassion, eventually transformed into cruelty. Actions that might have been motivated by fear or duty became mechanisms for asserting control. The very qualities that had enabled Xerxes to consolidate power, strategic thinking, vigilance, and decisiveness, now intersected with mistrust, obsession, and a willingness to punish perceived threats with extreme measures. It is within this context that the fate of his daughters must be understood. They were not merely victims of a father's cruelty, they were caught in the web of a monarch whose understanding of loyalty, love, and family had been deeply distorted by the pressures of absolute rule. By examining Xerxes' growing paranoia and tyranny, one begins to see the psychological mechanisms that made later horrors possible. His actions were not random. They were shaped by years of exposure to threats, responsibilities, and cultural expectations that valued obedience above affection and fear above trust. The palace, intended as a place of protection and education, became a stage for surveillance and control. The daughter's world, once a place of learning and cautious innocence, was increasingly overshadowed by the oppressive atmosphere created by their father's unrelenting vigilance. In conclusion, the seeds of Xerxes' tyranny were sown in his early experiences as a prince and nurtured by the immense pressures of kingship. Paranoia, initially a survival mechanism, evolved into an all-consuming need for control, shaping his perception of both allies and family members. His daughters, raised in the confined world of the royal harem, experienced firsthand the psychological weight of their father's fears and ambitions. The gilded walls that surrounded them could not protect them from the growing shadow of his tyranny. By understanding these seeds of paranoia, one can better comprehend the tragic trajectory of Xerxes' reign, how the combination of inherited pressure, personal disposition, and absolute power created a father whose actions toward his own children would ultimately become worse than death. The daughters of Xerxes I, once innocent children sheltered within the ornate walls of the royal harem, ultimately became pawns in a game dictated by fear, power, and paranoia. By the time Xerxes' growing tyranny had fully taken hold, even the sanctity of family could not shield them from his obsessive need for control. Their fate was sealed not by rebellion, disobedience, or betrayal, but by a father's conviction that power must be absolute and that the potential for disloyalty, even within his own bloodline, posed an existential threat. This is the tragic story of how royal daughters, born to privilege and opulence, were subjected to a decree that was both cruel and psychologically devastating, an ordeal far worse than death itself. The exact motivations behind Xerxes' decree remain the subject of speculation, but historical accounts and analyses suggest a combination of political caution, personal paranoia, and a desire to assert unchallengeable authority. In a kingdom where succession and loyalty were paramount, even the slightest hint of ambition in a potential heir could be construed as a threat. Xerxes, aware of the fragile balance of power and haunted by the examples of past palace intrigue, may have feared that his daughters, through marriage, alliances, or influence, could unwittingly become tools for rivals seeking to undermine his rule. In his mind, preemptive control was a necessity, and no measure was too severe when the preservation of authority was at stake. The royal harem, which had once been a place of both education and confinement, now became the setting for the king's ultimate assertion of control. The princesses, who had grown up navigating the delicate hierarchies of court life, were suddenly confronted with a reality where obedience was no longer a choice but a condition for survival. Historical interpretations suggest that Xerxes' actions toward his daughters went beyond mere punishment. They were psychological in nature, designed to break the spirit, enforce submission, and demonstrate the reach of his power. In this sense, the decree was not just an act of discipline, it was a calculated exercise in terror, meant to reinforce the absolute authority of the king over even those closest to him. The form of the decree itself, though not always clearly detailed in surviving records, appears to have involved both physical isolation and emotional manipulation. The princesses were confined to separate chambers within the palace, effectively cutting them off from one another and from trusted attendants who might have offered comfort or counsel. This isolation was a tool to erode solidarity, leaving each daughter to confront the king's wrath alone. In addition, the environment was deliberately structured to instill fear, constant surveillance, strict routines, and the presence of attendants whose primary role was to report any perceived signs of defiance or dissent. Even minor infractions, such as speaking without permission, showing emotion, or expressing personal preference, could be met with severe reprimand, reinforcing the precariousness of their position. Beyond physical control, Xerxes' decree inflicted psychological torment. The princesses were subjected to the unpredictable moods of a father whose authority had merged with paranoia. Affection, once a source of security, became a tool of anxiety, as praise and reprimand could shift without warning. They were forced to internalize the idea that loyalty must be absolute and that even love could be conditional, contingent upon adherence to the king's rigid expectations. In essence, their upbringing, a life steeped in obedience and decorum, became a weapon turned against them, making the palace itself a landscape of fear rather than protection. Marriage and betrothal, once potential avenues for alliances and prestige, now became instruments of cruelty. In some interpretations of historical accounts, Xerxes used the prospects of marriage not to reward or elevate his daughters, but to manipulate and control them. Arranged unions were dictated not by love or alliance alone, but by a desire to assert dominance over the princess's personal choices. Any hesitation, reluctance, or deviation from the king's wishes was perceived as rebellion, further justifying the psychological punishment inflicted upon them. The daughters' autonomy, already restricted by social and cultural expectations, was thus further eroded, leaving them dependent entirely on the king's caprice. One of the most devastating aspects of the decree was its erasure of normal childhood and adolescence. Activities that had once been sources of joy and learning, interaction with peers, playful exploration, and artistic expression, were curtailed or eliminated entirely. Tutors and attendants became agents of the king's authority, enforcing strict routines and discouraging behaviors that could suggest individuality or independence. Even play and education were subordinated to the king's overarching need for control. This created an environment in which the princess's emotional and psychological development was stunted, leaving them ill-prepared to resist or even comprehend the cruelty being imposed upon them. The decree's impact extended beyond the immediate physical and psychological constraints. The princesses were forced to witness the consequences of their father's wrath and the treatment of others within the court. Eunuchs, servants, and other members of the royal family who displeased the king were punished or removed, providing constant reminders of the dangers of defiance. The princesses were thus trapped not only by direct confinement, but also by the pervasive atmosphere of fear. The lesson was clear. Obedience was not a moral choice, but a necessity for survival, and even innocence could be criminal if interpreted as a threat. Historical analyses suggest that Xerxes' actions had long-term consequences on the psychological well-being of his daughters. The constant surveillance, isolation, and manipulation created trauma that would linger throughout their lives. Fear replaced trust, caution replaced curiosity, and the security that should have been provided by a father's love was replaced with dread. The decree, intended as a demonstration of authority, simultaneously undermined the very familial bonds that might have offered resilience and protection. In this sense, the suffering inflicted was more profound than any physical punishment, striking at the core of identity, autonomy, and emotional security. The cruelty of Xerxes' decree becomes even more apparent when compared to contemporary practices of royal discipline. While authoritarian measures were common in royal households, the particular combination of psychological manipulation, isolation, and absolute control exercised by Xerxes stands out for its severity. Many royal children in antiquity were subject to strict instruction and oversight, but rarely were they subjected to a sustained campaign of fear orchestrated with such meticulous attention to their emotional vulnerability. In this context, Xerxes' actions can be seen as both historically extreme and personally destructive, highlighting the dangers of absolute power when coupled with paranoia. In some accounts, the king's daughters attempted to navigate their constrained lives with caution and strategy, adhering strictly to expected behaviors while seeking small ways to assert agency. These efforts, however, were largely futile. The very environment designed to educate, protect, and prepare them for their roles had been repurposed as a mechanism of control. Every action, no matter how minor, was subject to interpretation, leaving the princesses in a constant state of anxiety and self-monitoring. In effect, they were prisoners of both circumstance and perception, caught in a web spun by a father whose love had been eclipsed by fear and obsession. Ultimately, Xerxes' decree represents a profound moral and emotional violation. It was an act that undermined the natural bonds between parent and child, replacing them with a system of control, fear, and coercion. The daughters, whose upbringing had been shaped by both privilege and constraint, were forced to endure an ordeal that violated not only their freedom, but their very sense of self. The severity of the decree underscores the dangers inherent in absolute power, particularly when wielded by a ruler whose capacity for empathy had been overshadowed by paranoia. In conclusion, the fate of Xerxes' daughters, dictated by this cruel decree, stands as a tragic testament to the consequences of unbridled authority and fear. They were subjected to isolation, psychological torment, and manipulation, stripped of autonomy and forced to navigate a world where even familial love was conditional. The princesses' suffering was not a consequence of their actions, but of the intersection of power, paranoia, and tyranny. Their story is a stark reminder that absolute rule, when unchecked, can transform even the most innocent into victims of a system designed to assert control at any cost. The reign of Xerxes I, often celebrated in history for his monumental architectural achievements and his ambitious military campaigns, carries a darker, more haunting legacy, one defined by fear, tyranny, and the suffering inflicted upon his own family. While ancient chronicles frequently highlight his role in the Persian Wars, particularly the invasions of Greece, a deeper examination of his character reveals a ruler whose paranoia and cruelty left indelible marks not only on his empire, but on the most vulnerable members of his household. his daughters. The legacy of horror that surrounds Xerxes is intertwined with the tension between public grandeur and private tyranny, demonstrating how absolute power can corrupt even familial bonds. Xerxes' legacy is inseparable from the psychological and emotional torment he inflicted on his daughters. Historical reconstructions, drawn from sources like Herodotus, and subsequent analyses of Persian court life, suggest that the princess's suffering was both profound and lasting. Their upbringing, once carefully structured to instill obedience, education, and cultural refinement, had been transformed into a mechanism of control and fear. The cruel decree imposed upon them, the isolation, surveillance, and constant psychological manipulation, shattered the natural bonds of family affection and replaced them with dread and anxiety. This experience highlights the human cost of Xerxes' paranoia, revealing a ruler whose desire for control eclipsed even paternal instinct. In assessing Xerxes' legacy, it is essential to consider the broader context of his reign. The Persian Empire during his rule was vast, sophisticated, and culturally diverse, encompassing regions that spanned thousands of miles. Administering such an empire required extraordinary organizational skill, military strategy, and political diplomacy. Xerxes demonstrated competence in these areas, overseeing infrastructure projects, monumental constructions such as the Gate of All Nations at Persepolis, and expansive campaigns to secure the empire's borders. These accomplishments, however, coexist uneasily with the evidence of his cruelty, revealing a paradox at the heart of his rule. A monarch capable of awe-inspiring feats, yet capable of inflicting immense suffering upon those closest to him. This duality, public magnificence paired with private terror, shaped the way history remembers Xerxes. On one hand, he is celebrated as a great Persian king, a figure whose ambition and vision contributed to the empire's enduring cultural and political influence. On the other hand, his reign is remembered for the oppressive measures he took to maintain control, including the extreme measures taken against his daughters. This juxtaposition complicates our understanding of Xerxes' fork. Historians to confront the tension between achievement and atrocity, between strategic genius and moral corruption. The treatment of his daughters in particular serves as a lens through which to understand the broader mechanisms of power and fear in the Persian court. Royal women were never entirely free from the dynamics of political utility, but Xerxes' actions went beyond customary control and discipline. By isolating, surveilling, and psychologically manipulating his daughters, he created an environment in which obedience was enforced through terror rather than guidance. The princess's suffering was not incidental. It was a deliberate consequence of a system designed to prioritize authority over affection, control over empathy. In this sense, the horrors they endured were emblematic of a ruler whose personal insecurities and absolute power converged with devastating effects. The historical record also indicates that Xerxes' tyranny extended beyond his family to other elements of the Persian court. Advisors, officials, generals, and even eunuchs were subject to his exacting scrutiny and ruthless enforcement of loyalty. Rebellions and perceived disloyalty were met with harsh punishment, demonstrating that the mechanisms of control within the palace mirrored those applied to the wider empire. In this way, the suffering of his daughters can be seen as part of a larger pattern, the internalization of fear as a governing principle. The palace, rather than a sanctuary, became a microcosm of the empire itself, where absolute obedience was demanded and deviation, even accidental, was met with severe consequences. The psychological impact of Xerxes' actions resonates across generations, shaping both contemporary perceptions and historical memory. The princess's experiences provide a vivid illustration of the human cost of absolute authority. Their lives were marked by the constant tension between visibility and invisibility. They were celebrated as symbols of royal lineage, yet trapped within the mechanisms of control designed to assert the king's dominance. This duality underscores the profound tragedy of their situation, highlighting that the consequences of tyranny are often invisible in public records, only becoming apparent through careful consideration of familial and personal histories. Xerxes' legacy of horror is further amplified by the moral questions his actions raise. What is the cost of absolute power? How does paranoia affect those entrusted with immense authority? The treatment of his daughters offers a stark answer. When fear and obsession dictate the exercise of power, even those closest to the ruler become vulnerable. By subordinating paternal instinct to paranoia, Xerxes illustrates how authority, if unchecked, can corrupt not only political institutions but also the most intimate human relationships. History remembers not only his architectural and military achievements, but also the suffering that was often concealed behind the palace walls, a testament to the dangers of centralized, unaccountable power. Scholars examining Xerxes' reign have noted that his behavior toward his daughters provides insight into the broader culture of Persian royalty. While kingship required vigilance and control, Xerxes' actions exceeded traditional norms, revealing a psychological dimension to tyranny that goes beyond mere political expediency. The use of fear as a tool of domestic governance was not simply a reflection of political necessity, it represented a personal compulse. Ion, a manifestation of the king's internalization of threat and suspicion. In this sense, the fate of his daughters is both an individual tragedy and a case study in the broader dynamics of power, obedience, and cruelty. The enduring fascination with Xerxes in historical narratives also stems from the stark contrast between his public image and private actions. To the world, he was a king of immense resources, commanding armies that spanned continents and commissioning constructions that would inspire awe for millennia. In private, however, he was capable of inflicting psychological torment on those he should have protected most. This duality forces a reconsideration of how rulers are remembered. Monumental achievements do not erase the suffering caused by cruelty, and historical memory must account for both triumph and terror. In cultural memory, Xerxes' daughters stand as silent witnesses to the horrors of unchecked power. Their suffering, largely overshadowed by accounts of military campaigns and imperial grandeur, underscores the human cost of tyranny. While the Persian Empire thrived under his leadership in terms of administration, architecture, and influence, the personal toll on his family highlights the destructive consequences of fear-driven governance. By examining their experiences, historians gain a fuller understanding of the moral and psychological dimensions of his rule, revealing that the legacy of a king is not measured solely by conquest or construction, but also by the well-being of those closest to him. Ultimately, Xerxes' legacy of horror serves as both a historical lesson and a cautionary tale. It illustrates the dangers of absolute authority when coupled with paranoia, the fragility of familial bonds under tyranny, and the human consequences of power exercised without empathy. The suffering of his daughters, confined within the palace, led at every turn, and subjected to psychological manipulation, remains one of the most poignant examples of how royal privilege can coexist with profound vulnerability. In this light, Xerxes' reign is remembered not only for its grandeur, but also for the shadow it cast over the lives of his children, a shadow that endures in the historical imagination as a warning of the perils of unbridled power. In conclusion, the legacy of Xerxes. The first is one of profound complexity. His architectural achievements, imperial campaigns, and vision for the Persian Empire ensured his place in history as a powerful and ambitious ruler. Yet, beneath these accomplishments lies a darker narrative, one defined by tyranny, fear, and the suffering of those closest to him. The psychological and emotional torment inflicted upon his daughters serves as a chilling testament to the corrupting influence of absolute power. History remembers Xerxes not only for the empire he ruled, but for the human cost of his reign, illustrating that the shadow of tyranny can reach even into the most intimate corners of family life. leaving a legacy far worse than death itself.